They both pursue what is best to maintain their regional hegemony and power, not to adhere to any moral standard. Realpolitik is the command of the day, not morality.
The motion before the House tonight is that this House believes there is no moral difference between the American and Russian foreign policy. To open the case for side proposition, I look to the librarian, Balliol College, Musa Haraj. And the librarian chair should be yielded to the CCC wherever you are.
He's taking my chair already. Mr. President, esteemed guests, and members of the House, we gather here tonight to debate a provocative, perhaps even scandalous proposition, one that shakes the very foundations of how we see global politics. That this House believes there is no moral difference between the foreign policy of the United States and that of Russia. Now, I know that some of you, particularly those who have been raised in Hollywood movies, where America is always the hero, may find this claim outrageous. After all, the United States champions democracy, freedom, and liberty, while Russia, we are told, is the villain, the perennial antagonist in our modern Cold War sequel. But let us strip away the rhetoric, the chanting, the flag waving, and examine what these two superpowers actually do rather than what they say. Because when we do, a simple truth emerges. Both are empires. Both have left destruction in their wake. Both do not have an ounce of morality in their foreign policy. And let me be clear, both only pursue power, not principle. Morality in their foreign policy? That's about as believable as a Russian opposition candidate making it to election day, or an arms dealer calling for world peace. In short, non-existent. They both pursue what is best to maintain their regional hegemony and power, not to adhere to any moral standard. Realpolitik is the command of the day, not morality. And therefore, there is no moral difference in their foreign policies because they do not have moral foreign policies. But before I make my case, it is my pleasure to introduce the speakers who are going to make the case for side opposition. Speaking first is our very own treasurer, Sarah Rana. Now let's talk about Sarah's meteoric rise to the position of treasurer. Sarah, much like in Russia, has proven that you don't always need an election to take power. Rising to the top, not by a popular vote, but by simply waiting for a convenient vacancy. If she really believes there's a moral difference between America and Russia, she might want to start by looking at her own route to office. But in all seriousness, Sarah is a dear friend of mine and has been a pillar of strength for all of us this term. Speaking second in opposition is His Excellency Guillermo Lasso, the former president of Ecuador. Mr. President, it is an honor to participate in this debate with you, and we welcome you to the Union. Though I believe you would fit in extremely well with the Union, because just like our own president, you ran first for president and decisively lost. So both of you have a shared record of running for president and losing only to win at a later time. Speaking third, we have Andrei Soldatov, a Russian investigative journalist. Mr. President, I must say, Andrei's presence here tonight is nothing short of impressive. After all, investigative journalism in Russia is an extreme sport, one where the stakes are often exile, imprisonment, or the occasional mysterious cup of tea. Andrei, you're living proof that one can criticize the Russian state and still be alive to tell the tale. A feat almost as rare as an election in Moscow. But it is an honor to have you. We also have Ambassador Eric Ramanathan, who transitioned from being a top Democratic fundraiser to the US ambassador to Sweden. it's heartwarming to see that in American politics, the shortest path to diplomacy is through your wallet. Mr. President, these are your speakers, and they're most welcome. Now, the US and Russia both operate under a very simple guiding principle that might makes right. They do not act based on some moral compass or some divine right to spread freedom or sovereignty. No, what drives their foreign policies is power, influence, and self-interest. Take the example of Ukraine. Both superpowers claim to be acting in defense of sovereignty, of democracy, of security. Yet for all their resources and influence, neither of them have resolved the war. Instead, they prolong it, they escalate it, and they ensure it's in continuation, all while cloaking their involvement in moral rhetoric. Does Russia's bombardment of Mariupol differ in any fundamental moral way from the US flattening of Fallujah? Does America's shock and awe campaign in Baghdad hold some unique ethical high ground over Russian missile strikes in Kyiv? Can we, with straight faces, say that one country's proxy wars, assassinations, and military occupations are noble, where the other countries are evil? The answer is simple. Both are empires, and both pursue power, not principle. Now let's compare their records side by side. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq on a lie, the false claim that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. The war killed hundreds of thousands of people, displaced millions, and left the country in ruins. The US called it liberation. The world called it illegal aggression. Similarly, in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine under the pretense of denazification and protecting Russian speakers. The war, again, killed tens of thousands, displaced millions, and left the country in ruins. This time, again, Russia called it liberation, but the world calls it illegal aggression. But members of the House, these are not anomalies. They are patterns of imperial behavior. In 2011, when the US led a NATO intervention in Libya, declaring that it was necessary to protect civilians and defend democracy against a brutal dictator, the world was told that this is a humanitarian mission, that America and its allies are standing for human rights. But let's be clear, the objective was regime change. The US and NATO wanted Gaddafi removed because he was unpredictable, opposed Western influence in the region, and controlled vast oil reserves that Western powers had strong interest in securing. Once he was killed, the US and its allies lost their interest. They packed up, they left and abandoned Libya to its fate. What followed was a total collapse. Armed militia seized power. The country descended into civil war. And to this day, Libya remains fractured, unstable, and struggling. The so-called humanitarian intervention achieved its real strategic goal, removing Gaddafi, but it left Libya in ruins. Under similar moral pretenses, Russia launched a military intervention in Syria in 2015. This time, claiming it was necessary to fight terrorism and defend stability. The world was told that Russia was stopping the spread of extremism, that it was preserving order in the Middle East. But again, let's be honest, the real objective was to prop up Bashar al-Assad, Russia's loyal client dictator, and to secure Russia's only Mediterranean naval base in Tartus. Once Russia ensured Assad's survival and strengthened its military foothold in the region, it scaled back its involvement, leaving Syria to a never-ending war and humanitarian crisis. I mean, Aleppo was left in ruins. Civilians bore the brunt of brutal bombings, and the very stability that Russia promised never came. Just like in Libya, Russia stepped in, achieved its real interest, strategic interests, under a moral pretense, and then abandoned the country to disaster. 2 interventions, 2 superpowers claiming moral justification, and 2 nations devastated and abandoned in their wake. So members of the House, I ask you, what really is the moral difference between these 2 self-interested titans? Some of you, disturbed by the case I'm presenting, might argue that America has a rules-based order. that America fights for human rights, and that its foreign policy, though flawed, is at least rooted in good intentions. I have 3 words for you: Chile, Vietnam, Guatemala. The idea of a benign American foreign policy, for all its pomp and self-indulgent mythology, is a myth, inaccurate at best and deeply malign at worst. American foreign policy only champions democracy when it suits their interests. The US has toppled democratically elected governments across the world when those governments did not serve its interests. In 1973, it backed a coup against Salvador Allende in Chile, leading to years of brutal dictatorship under Pinochet. In Vietnam, it napalmed villages in the name of stopping communism. In Guatemala, it funded death squads. The idea that the United States fights for democracy is a public relations campaign. It's not a reality. And Russia, well, it's the same. It claims to protect its people in its sphere of influence, but in reality, it also supports dictators like Assad. It suppresses oppression in Belarus and has turned Ukraine into a war zone. What's the difference? The only difference between the two is that America has better branding. Both of them use economic warfare as a means for global domination. The US uses sanctions as a weapon to crush nations economically. Just ask Cuba, Venezuela, or Iran. Russia, meanwhile, leverages its energy resources to blackmail Europe and fund mercenary groups like the Wagner Group to extract wealth from Africa. Both use economic tools not to uplift, but to dominate. The US imposed crushing economic sanctions on rogue states under the banner of human rights. Yet very conveniently, when its own allies like Saudi Arabia engage in mass execution and war crimes like they do in Yemen, it ignores them. Russia condemns Western interventions, yet, when it suits its interests, props up authoritarian regime like Assad's Syria, all while framing its actions as protecting sovereignty. Some will claim that America's system at least allows for accountability, that the presidents are scrutinized, that mistakes are corrected. But tell me this, when was the last time an American president was tried for war crimes? When was the last time a CIA officer faced justice for overthrowing a government? The United States decries Russia's influence operations. The US openly funds those opposition movements in countries like Venezuela and Iran. It condemns Russian military interventions, yet months ago, it was dropping thousands of bombs on Yemen. If you believe there is a fundamental moral difference, you are not looking at the world as it is. You are looking at the world as they market it to you. Indeed, one of the greatest tricks the empire has ever pulled is convincing the world that their wars, that their interventions, that their economic coercion are all for a higher cause. That they act not out of self-interest, but they're acting out of duty, virtue, and moral responsibility. And yet, if we follow the pattern, we see the same moral script played over and over again, just merely with different accents. The moral justification is a disguise, a narrative tool, a political weapon. They don't act for morality, they act for power. And morality is simply the wrapping paper they use to sell their wars. And you know the most tragic part? The world keeps falling for it. To Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, let us not be fooled by flags, anthems, and carefully curated moral narratives. When we strip away the propaganda, when we strip away the ideological spin and the selective outrage, the reality becomes clear. Both America and Russia act on power, not on principle. They both have left nations in ruins. They both have justified unjustifiable wars. They both have wielded morality as a weapon while ignoring its constraints. And that, honorable members, is why there is no moral difference between the foreign policy of the United States and that of Russia. One is simply better at marketing its imperialism, slicker in its delivery, but the underlying mechanisms remain the same. I urge all of you to side with the truth over illusion and vote for side proposition. Thank you very much.
Though the US has committed, probably on impact, the same amount of catastrophes, war crimes, the way that they operate is different from Russia in terms of how they practice their foreign policy, and two, the justifications used, which is often under capitalist and neoliberal frameworks.
I look to the first speaker on opposition, which is the treasurer and St. Anthony's College, Sarah Rana. I yield the chair to the treasurer.
I'm just testing. Okay. I actually want to begin on a personal note. See, I grew up during the War on Terror. The first 10 years of my life, I witnessed the way that the US, for the sake of their foreign policy, was tracking Muslims. There was growing anti-Arab and Muslim rhetoric. They used trackers to track even our praying apps. We even got bugged in our home. The reason why I want to start off with that is that I'm not going to come up here and defend the US's abhorrent record of human rights. That's not the point of this debate. In fact, there's two key pieces of framing that I want to set for you guys when you decide to vote on this motion. Firstly, this debate on net is not about differences in moral impacts. Human loss is human loss. We cannot do a disservice to any victim of a war machine, but to not engage with the nuances of the strategy of great powers like the US and Russia is to do a disservice to this debate. Secondly, it may seem intuitive to you to listen to proposition. Look at Russia's involvement in Ukraine, in Syria, the US invasion of Iraq, its proxy warfare in Syria as well, and the US backing of genocide in Palestine. And think to yourself, wow, there's really no difference between the two. But again, what I want you to think about is what is the moral framework that underpins both of these great powers? And while those points may seem relevant of what Proposition just said, that's not the entire debate. So this is not about who's done it worst. It's about engaging with what moral frameworks make up both powers. Now, before I get into my point, I have to introduce the speakers. Sorry, my voice is gone. So we just heard from Musa, the librarian. Now, I actually won't be roasting Musa because recently Musa and I went on a trip to Egypt, and what happened in Egypt stays in Egypt. Secondly, we will hear from Israr, our very own president. Now, Israr specifically instructed me not to say anything too incriminating in my roasts, which says a lot about how he likes to play both sides. See, I've gotten to know my dear president over the past few months. He rose to power playing both sides, and honestly, in every conversation we've had, he's managed to argue both sides in virtually every topic so well that no one really knows what he stands for. So of course he'd argue with the ambiguity on US and Russia foreign policy, because he's definitely up there with them. So I wouldn't be surprised if he decided to argue against himself halfway in the debate, or that he ends up switching sides to our side. Speaking third, we have Vladimir Pozny, who was actually quite iconic in the US and Russia, especially during the 90s. I wasn't alive at the time, but your work is absolutely fascinating. You're best known in the West for his television appearances representing and explaining the views of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. He was memorable as a spokesman for the Soviets, in part because he grew up in the US and speaks fluent English, Russian, and French, and was also the host of the iconic show Pozny, where he interviewed public figures. So I'm very glad to have you in this debate. Speaking last is Liza, PPE first-year student. And of course she'd be on that side of the house because her dad is a Russian oligarch. And I'm pretty sure she's an FSB agent for Russia. So these are your speakers, and they're most welcome, Mr. President. I also want to give a quick shout out to my supervisor, Professor Michael Rochlitz, for his wonderful lessons in our political economy of Russia course. Okay, now let's get to my argument. So my first argument is actually on doing a comparative analysis, let's first start off with Russia, and then we'll start off with the US, and I'll be specifically talking about the moral frameworks that their foreign policy operates under, and I'll also be giving examples. So first argument on Russia. Russia's foreign policy is centered around strongman imperial policies. Why is this true? Well, first, let's talk about their moral underpinning. Russia claims to resist Western imposition. It defends its idea of its own sovereignty. And the mechanism we often see is that they will use annexation in order to exercise this. We see this in the case of Ukraine. We saw this in the case of Chechnya. And we also saw this in the subsequent massacres that happened, especially in Chechnya. The point here is that foreign policy is often crafted on strongman politics in Russia and to oppose the US and demand respect. So this translates to the idea that Russia wants to preserve its own sovereignty, and thus Russia's moral view of foreign policy is shaped by, firstly, a sense of so-called historical grievances. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Putin shortly after embodied the frustrated, when he came to power, frustrated Russian imperialist and the conviction that the West perpetually seeks Russia's downfall. Secondly, it encompasses a no true ally stance. And so it emphasizes hard power deployments and demanding respect from major world players, chiefly the US. This results in Russia's belief that it will never have any true allies. Yes, we're seeing Trump cozy up to Putin, but this doesn't mean that they ever view the US as an equal or as a potential ally, no matter how short-termist it may seem. Secondly, it means that they also don't really buy into non-financial multilateral blocs or international commitments. For instance, it doesn't really believe in the UN, and it's often been able to assert itself through military presence, through its mercenaries and the Orthodox Church, or its own forces with virtually no accountability. And thus, Putin's foreign policy could be defined as that frustrated Russian imperialist, and this has actually become very salient over time. So how is the US different? Currently, Trump's policies, and I'm looking at Trump more recently, but I'll be explaining other administrations in my second argument, but how is the US different? For Trump, his policies are all about making a deal, getting additional benefits for the US in cash, rare earth. We saw this with the mineral deal, new resource deals, but it's not about, and this is crucial, it's not about an emotional necessity to rebuild an empire that's been lost, which is what Russia and Putin seek. He's not seeking annexation externally. Domestically, he has his own policies that talk about making America great again. But the US does not use annexation. It often will use other egregious means like proxy warfare or funding settler colonial states like Israel. But looking at Trump, in fact, in his policies in his first term, they were actually quite isolationist, and he withdrew from specific regions in the Middle East. For Putin, it seems quite the opposite, where he has no impunity. A second important point is that Trump's current policies reinforce this difference in both countries' foreign policies. Until recently, yes, the Russian public was supporting the Ukraine war, but this support was seen as quite lukewarm. People were obviously not overly enthusiastic about it. But now with Trump's recent deal and the way that they voted in the UN, Trump offers Putin basically a victory in Ukraine on a silver platter. However, what he seems to be willing to do is just to end the conflict and obviously secure a deal out of it, which we see in the minerals deal. And there's a danger that Putin's war will be seen as a success domestically more now than ever before. And Russia's foreign policy will become even more imperialist because it shows that Putin was quote unquote right about what he did. Now, the second key thing that you should remember is that Putin often says that his actions are necessitated because of historical grievances, i.e. after the Cold War, NATO, America, and the West basically pushed out any success for Russia. But this is actually not true. Firstly, we saw that there was some type of engagement from America and Western powers. In 1994, there was the EU-Russia Partnership and Cooperation Agreement. In 1996, the Russia accession to the Council of Europe, despite Russia not meeting the economic standards, meeting the economic standards for membership. 1997, the NATO-Russia Founding Act. I can go on and on. We even saw the US completely overlooking the genocide in Chechnya. So let's look at Russia's policies outside of just Ukraine. As I said, Putin's imperial and strongman politics to build a Russian empire is justified by him and compels Russia to have a more forward military role in places like the Middle East and Africa, outdoing even some of the things we saw during the Soviet era. And it solidifies its self-image that way in two ways. First, given that they claim that the West does not respect Russia, which is obviously true, the Kremlin believes it must respond with displays of strength, military, diplomatic, whatever that looks like. Two, Putin does not answer foreign policy accountability to domestic citizens. This is important because, firstly, hundreds of thousands of Russians were conscripted to virtually fight in Ukraine. If they don't, they would probably get arrested. Two, the war in Chechnya, Ukraine, and even in Syria has moral underpinnings no matter the economic cost. This is about an idea of greater Russia, mostly, not just about security. Three, we're seeing Russia build many military bases, specifically within Africa, with no accountability at all, because they don't have any mechanism in its domestic framework in order to do that. I'll talk about how the US is different. Now, I'm not trying to say the US has not orchestrated pretty egregious war crimes. What I'm trying to say is that a lot of times US's interest in the way that they support a war will always be backed by economic means. Lastly, in Russia, the Orthodox Christian underpinning. Unlike the US that has a secular neoliberal moral framework, the US will try to use that to assert itself in different regions, specifically in the Middle East and Afghanistan. What we see with Russia, actually, specifically the Russian Orthodox Church, is that the Kremlin state has very close alignment with them. And this actually informs most of their policy in Syria, Ukraine, and Africa, which is very different moral frameworks than how the US operates. For example, in Budapest in 2019, Putin literally said that he's supporting backing in the Syrian proxy war because it's a top priority to support Christians and Orthodox Christians within Syria and to protect any Christians within the Middle East. This difference is highlighted by Russia itself. In any discourse they have about the US, they point out and critique that the US is becoming more atheist, especially in its actions abroad and its foreign policy, and it's seen as a corruption of values. Let's quickly compare this to the US. Now, the US will claim universal values of neoliberalism, secularism, democracy, and yes, they're very hypocritical about it. They will commit egregious human rights crimes. They'll talk about market freedoms and why they're doing it for a capitalist agenda. And they even talk about eradicating religious theocracies, and they claim to be morally justified in all those instances. And thus, their interventions get couched as promoting democracy, like in Afghanistan when they put a transitional government after. Secondly, very last, and this is my last point, the US's moral framework is of secular neoliberalism. It doesn't matter what's going on with evangelical Christians in the domestic US framework. We're talking about foreign policy. The reason why the US cannot just go and annex territories is because in part they either work through proxy warfare, drone warfare, or they'll fund settler states like I mentioned with Israel. And a lot of times as we see that there are specific accountability frameworks within the US domestically, we see this with protests in the anti-war movement, which happened after disaster in Iraq. That actually led to a change in policy and how they conduct their foreign policy. We saw the establishment of the Director of National Intelligence. We saw changes to the 2002 National Intelligence Estimate. In all of these changes, we saw specific accountability measures happen within the Senate and Congress when it comes to foreign policy, specifically within 2017 during Trump's first term. And so what you should take away from this is that though the US has committed probably on impact the same amount of catastrophes, war crimes, the way that they operate is different from Russia in terms of how they practice their foreign policy, and two, the justifications used, which is often under capitalist and neoliberal frameworks. And so, in the end of my speech, when you vote today, remember that proposition had to prove that there is no moral difference at all, and that's a high threshold and burden for them to fulfill. All you have to do when you vote is to decide if I prove to you that there's some moral difference between both powers. And if I did that, you should vote opposition. I beg to oppose.
Between 2018 to 2025 alone, American government undertook, under the guise of counterterrorism operations, in more than 70 countries. By contrast, Russia, 25 military interventions since 1991, Yet Russia is aggressive.
To continue the case for side proposition, I look to the President, Regents Park College.
"41 years ago in 1984, in this very chamber, we debated the same motion. Then, it was between American and Soviet foreign policy. Tonight, we debate the same motion, but between American and Russian foreign policy. It's very unfortunate that we have to debate this motion because we stand at the precipice of a time where the greatest crimes are committed by those who claim a moral high ground. The opposition is going to do something very smart, which you have seen already. That you will hear analogies, not analysis, that they will argue that the American foreign policy is not perfect. It has issues, but it is better than the Russian. You heard already? I urge you to not be drawn by that rhetoric. You may have your biases and it may feel very natural and comfortable tonight. That when it is worse, America is slightly better than Russia. I urge that in tonight's motion, you put your biases aside and based on logical arguments and the evidence presented to you, that you vote on that basis. I also agree with the opposition that this framework is a nuance that we have to argue on this side, and both sides, in fact. And let me be clear on the outset that we do not argue on this side proposition that Russia's foreign policy is good. We argue that Washington is no better. One calls its wars liberation, the other calls them security operations. The nuance presented by side opposition is absolutely ridiculous. What they have so far presented to you is this, that Russia invades, so does America. But what is the nuance? One wants to stay, the other wants to invade for 20 years, take all minerals away, keep the ruins away, and be like, we're gone. That cannot be the only thing. More importantly, they argue that the difference is that in Russia, at least, people can, in America, at least, once America kills, mayhems, economic destruction around the world, that there can be protests in America. Whereas in Russia, you don't have that. That is not sufficient. The burden on side proposition is to prove that Russia is not that. Russia's foreign policy is not morally superior, neither is America's. But as I unveil the stark reality, as I present my statistics and facts to you, you may actually make the conclusion that America's foreign policy may be worse. But before I go to my main argument, it's also natural to argue that foreign policies are not based on morality, that are based on self-interest. I tend to agree, but we are here in an exception. America is an exception because when America sells its foreign policy, it's not under the guise of self-interest. It's under the guise of democracy, human rights, economic prosperity. And that is what we call American exceptionalism. And we need to review, can America claim that moral high ground, that it does so? And talking about frameworks, as we heard on opposition, there has to be a framework. What is the standard that we judge the comparative of America and Russia that whose policy is moral? There is no precise metrics, but I do propose 3 metrics today. First, adherence to international law and human rights, political stability and peace promotion around the world. Third, economic influence, also including development versus exploitation. It's also important to narrow it down, to make it very easy for side opposition. I would not go too long into history to compare America's foreign policy. I'm not even going to touch on Vietnam or on the nuclear bombs in Japan, not even touch on those. All I will do is provide you a clear comparative of the time since the end of the Soviet Union, between 1991 to 2025. What has been the foreign policy of the two countries? And finally, one thing that will emerge tonight, this debate is also not about Donald Trump. Donald Trump may have accelerated America's foreign policy to the worst in the last 2 weeks, but the foreign policy we are talking about is for the last 3 decades. What is at least good about Trump, I must argue, is that at least when he sells foreign policy of America, it's not under the guise of morality. He's upfront about self-interest, while others are not. So let's talk about statistics and comparative. First, let's start with interventions in international law. 251 military interventions over more than 75 countries. This is the record of America's foreign intervention between 1991 to 2022. And this is a report by the US Congress Research Strategy. Every single year for the 3 decades, America has been at war somewhere, somehow. If not boots on the ground, then drones in the sky. If not fighter jets, then CIA-backed coups. If not outright invasion, then economic strangulation. From Afghanistan to Iraq, from Libya to Syria, from the drone strikes in Somalia to the destabilization in Latin America, there is no continent left untouched by American firepower. Between 2018 to 2025 alone, American government undertook, under the guise of counterterrorism operations, in more than 70 countries. By contrast, Russia, 25 military interventions since 1991, yet Russia is aggressive. Yes, Russia is. But we argue that Russia has violated sovereignty. But Moscow simply cannot match Washington's global supply, global appetite for war. And what is the cost of intervention? $8 billion burned in war since 2001. Money that could have rebuilt nations, but instead it buried them. And what about the human cost? 1 million people killed directly as a result of American intervention in post-9/11 wars. 500,000 people just alone died in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Pakistan. 3.6 to 3.8 million died as an indirect result of American wars post-9/11. 38 million people directly displaced as a result of American wars post-9/11 in countries like Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, and Afghanistan. But what's most shocking? That this number exceeds the total displaced by every war since 1900 except World War II. These are not statistics that I'm just getting out of my pocket. I urge you to look into a range of reports published by the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at the Brown University. 7.6 million children in malnutrition as a result of America's foreign wars. And let us not forget, Afghanistan was left in ruins, its economy shattered, its people starving, a country turned into graveyard after 20 years of American promises. Iraq, America invaded in 2003 to remove a dictator, only to replace him with warlords, sectarian violence, and the rise of ISIS. Libya, Washington helped overthrow Gaddafi, then left behind a failed state where warlords sell human beings in open market as slaves. And what about the Guantanamo Bay? So much for internal protests that for the last 2 decades, we still have Guantanamo Bay operating torture, humanitarian violations, the violation of international law, and the very framework and order that the opposition side has created. And when the United States allies commit genocide, Washington sends more weapons. The support for genocide in Palestine is ongoing. Instead, they publish memes about a new era, memes about a new era of development where the AI will tell where should be a Trump Tower built. And if the destruction of nations does not disturb you, then consider this. America now openly floats the idea of invading countries like Venezuela with oil, buying Greenland, Canada, threatening ICC judges, sanctioning them. A superpowers that sees entire nations as commodities should terrify us all. But let's then look into the second phase of comparative economic warfare and starvation by sanctions. When Washington does not bomb you, it starves you. Washington weaponizes the dollar, wielding sanctions like starvation on states. Well, Russia plays its own game as well, and we admit that, using energy as a blackmail to tighten its grip. But let us consider, it's America that controls 60% of the global reserves on currency, giving it the power to crush nations without firing a single bullet. Iraq, Venezuela, Iran, Afghanistan, Cuba, even Pakistan. These are nations throttled, not for tyranny, but for daring to defy Washington. As I said, one side calls it defending its interests, the other calls it resisting Western aggression. Members of the House, the ledgers of history is stained with the actions of both. If there is a moral difference between America and Russia, it's not a difference of substance, it's a difference of style. And when style is stripped away, we are left with the brutal truth. Power justifies itself, and morality is nothing more than a convenient myth. Ladies and gentlemen, when you walk through their door today, do not be convinced by rhetorics on the other side. Do not vote on the comfort, the biases that it's comfortable sitting in a Western institution to be protected by a Western ally. Look into these statistics and these facts. Whether Russia or America, in both we have old men dreaming wars for young people to die. I urge you to vote proposition.
American democracy may be challenged, but our Constitution, our system of government, ain't broken.
To continue the case for side opposition, I look to Ambassador Eric Ramanathan.
All right. Union officers and members, fellow speakers, friends, I'm honored to be here with you tonight in this esteemed institution of learning, surrounded by engaged thinkers and no doubt future leaders of the world. This forum is revered not only because it is dedicated to preserving freedom of expression, but because it has so often sowed the seeds of action on some of the most important political and philosophical issues of the day. And tonight, I ask that you oppose this dangerous notion of moral equivalence between American and Russian foreign policy because it is wrong, but also that you take inspiration to action to ensure that the motion remains as inaccurate tomorrow as it is today. U.S. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, under the Reagan administration, made global headlines as the underdog and the decisive winner of the debate here exactly 41 years ago. He argued that in the Soviet system, moral foreign policy was whatever a small handful of totalitarian leaders decides advances the cause of the Soviet state. The American view, in contrast, was that foreign policy is moral only if it advances our core principles and rights. Chiefly, that all of the power of government springs from the consent of the governed, and that we zealously protect freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of association in our country, so that this consent remains informed consent, so that each policy has a chance to be challenged or vindicated by public discussion and debate. In the Soviet Union, people were powerless to control or change foreign policy, determined by the government. In the US, if a majority of our people disapprove of our foreign policy, believe that the government is making a mistake, something can be done about it. It can change, and indeed it will change, like it did as the Vietnam War dragged on and the American people turned on against it. Not now, thanks. It's a compelling argument about totalitarianism versus freedom that still rings true today. The Soviet Union is, of course, no more. But in its place, President Putin has consolidated power in even fewer hands and embarked on an aggressive quest to rebuild a sphere of influence across the former Soviet empire and beyond, including literal annexation of Ukraine. Russia has thrown hundreds of thousands of bodies of its citizens at this imperialist quest, while stealing perhaps half as many Ukrainian lives, countless homes, in wreaking widespread misery on Ukrainians. 41 years later, America lives on with the same system of government and much the same constitution it's enjoyed for nearly 250 years, with no material amendments in over 50 years. As my friend Jay Johnson said so eloquently on this stage just 2 months ago, American democracy may be challenged, but our Constitution, our system of government, ain't broken. Now, I was none too fond of the Reagan years. As a gay teenage activist watching friends die of HIV/AIDS in America and around the globe while our government dithered and discriminated. But if moral judgments about the directionality of US executive action were our guide, I would have to concede the proponents have been handed an awful lot of juicy ammunition in the past 38 days to suggest the situation today is bleaker. You've heard the parade of horribles, expansionist rhetoric, gutting of US soft power humanitarian programs, insidious musings about forced displacement of Gazans, extortionist demands and exclusionary negotiations tipped to Russian aggressors while leaving Ukraine and Europe off the table. It is appalling. I served 3 years as our nation's ambassador to Sweden, a diplomatic hub that works hard to earn the reputation as a moral role model. When Russia attacked Ukraine, we got to work building transatlantic partnerships with nearly unprecedented solidarity about how to respond to Russia's aggression and how to make hard and often expensive choices on how we could deter it together. We didn't care if Sweden or our other partners had divergent policy interests in other areas or rejected nuclear arms deployment on their soil as part of military deterrence. Unlike Russia, we didn't want vassals, we wanted allies. I led a diverse team guiding Sweden into the NATO alliance, supporting a politically and culturally difficult change, a tectonic shift to abandon 210 years of effective neutrality. That's longer than Switzerland has been neutral. And then fighting for it through 2 long, hard years of dispersed resistance from NATO allies with competing agendas, Quran-burning provocateurs, and of course, Russia and its hybrid conflict minions. It took a full court press of assurances and collaboration in every sector of society, at every level of our relationship. Almost everything I accomplished as ambassador was either related to Ukraine assistance and the NATO accession process, or it was made possible because that monumental feat drew the direct engagement of over half our president's cabinet, over 1/8 of our military flag officers, more than 1/4 of the United States Congress. They stood by my side in front of the press and declared things like, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, and we stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. I have to believe their voices will rise again. The details of the new administration's month-old foreign policy remain sparse, and assessment of the real-world impacts are premature. But we know the appeasement of Russia is real, and we know that the firings of so many of our own seasoned government servants who might speak truth to power are real. And what we've seen and heard in the rhetoric is a chilling expression of what America first could look like, a novel vision of transactional alliances that might not be held together with force like the former Warsaw Pact, but where intimidation and threat are nonetheless considered valid currency. It pisses me off as a diplomat and as an American. I reckon it upsets you too. But we need to take a big step back from the precipice of submission to permanent moral defeat. The new administration seems to operate on the same drone theory that has proven so effective in Ukraine. Launch a flood of offensive disruption in the hopes that a few ideas might sneak past the institutional defenses. And despite our system's upfront checks on executive power, some of these outrageous policies floated in the headlines may indeed move forward. But the logic behind Weinberger's argument still holds true. The moral difference between Soviet and American foreign policy, Weinberger implicitly argued, and I'm affirmatively emphasizing today as between US and Russia, does not derive from the objective judgment that can be made about specific actions, about tactics and even full-fledged strategies deployed by our respective nations at any one point in time, be they perceived or even adjudicated as legal or illegal, right or wrong. They derive from the morality of the system itself, the idea that the American people can rise up and speak out in protest of the impacts that they see and feel, can argue in the public square, leverage our robust civil society, our philanthropies, even our private sector companies to amplify their views, to sound the alarm, to pressure our government representatives. We can cause our government to reverse course or take a new direction. Not now, thanks. The toolbox for doing so has evolved and been challenged and tested by time and technology, but they remain in essence the same as they were 41 years ago. Free and fair elections, standing quite strong after several years of attempted assault and derision. Free press in the media, still vibrant and diverse despite legal attacks. And now, of course, social media, at once both the ultimate bullhorn of empowerment of free speech and association of the masses, but also a hazardous tool for amplifying disinformation to distract and confuse the truth. A great deal of destruction will be inflicted and pain will be felt if many of these foreign policy ideas are implemented. It may take a while to change, too long, months or years marked by human suffering, loss of American clout, economic shockwaves, rising insecurity, or even war. But there is, as Adam Smith once wryly observed, a great deal of ruin in a nation. And America is strong and resilient enough to absorb a great deal of pain and still bounce back. Resistance is growing stronger by the day. We're only on day 38. And in the court of popular opinion, in the next election cycle, the voices of the masses will be heard. Americans will reject the consequences of these ideas in time. We'll throw off the yoke of policies that undermine our own national security, that aim to punish our speech and our freedom, that repeatedly leverage threats and intimidation against our friends, alienating partners that we need to mount a collective response to inherently globalized threats like climate change, pandemics, and mass migration. We'll strengthen our alliances once again to align with core values of personal freedom and collective freedom. And we'll be influenced, even in our stubbornly self-reliant nation, by our partners and friends around the world. By witnessing which door you walk through tonight. The door that succumbs to despair, to resignation, that America's foreign policy seems to have taken such a turn towards ruthless instrumentalism, or the one that signals resistance to wrongful actions, calling out the things that are wrong, investing in the moral system of democracy and the primacy of debate in rooms like this to correct course. Unlike in Russia, you won't be arrested or worse for advancing either view, but only the no door empowers you and me, and indeed every speaker here tonight, to fight on for what is right. And that is why you should vote no on the proposition. Thank you. I can take a question if that one still comes back.
I was just going to ask, do you think democratic tyranny is more justified than oligarchy?
I think, defining democratic tyranny is amorphous, but I think that any wrongful act needs to be called out. I care about what is right and wrong. You should care about what's right and wrong. That's not my argument today. The point is that the moral difference between the US and Russian systems is that we can change things. When something wrong happens, we can call it out, we can rise up against it, and we can change what happens going forward.
After all, Putin himself claims that the threat of NATO expansion triggered Russia's invasion of Ukraine, essentially a fear of losing the Russian sphere of influence.
To continue the case for side opposition, I look to Andrei Soldato.
Well, I understand how difficult it is to argue in opposition to this motion, especially given everything that Donald Trump has already done to blur the lines between American and Russian foreign policies. However, the very fact that both Trump and Elon Musk are attacking US institutions so aggressively, and that Elon Musk specifically promotes the idea of the second American Revolution, signals, at least to me, a deviation of US policy. So let's set aside Trump's actions, at least for a moment. It is hard, and perhaps even impossible, to argue that any morality remains in US foreign policy given the actions of multiple US administrations in the Middle East and, to be honest, elsewhere. And as a journalist, I would be putting myself in an extremely difficult position. We journalists are not to defend anyone but the underdog, and the United States is surely not the underdog. Therefore, my goal today is not to argue who is better and who has corrupted more foreign politicians, but to highlight the differences between the US and Russian foreign policies. By the way, full disclaimer, I've never been funded by USAID or any US government institutions, nor do I receive any financial support from the government of this country. I am, however, on the wanted list of the Russian authorities because of investigating Russian security agencies for 25 years. I strongly believe that even if the international actions of the two countries sometimes appear very similar to each other, they are driven by fundamentally different motivations. One could easily argue that US foreign policy has been driven by a complex of superiority and coupled with a sense for a global mission, and obviously greed and adventurism. But I would argue that Russian foreign policy for at least a century has been driven primarily by fear. Russian foreign policy has been determined by political masters motivated by any popular movement in the country and abroad, and this is a fear that dates back to Vladimir Lenin's time. It sounds quite extraordinary, but yes, the Soviet regime, born out of a revolutionary movement, developed a strong fear of another revolution. The same people who had destroyed the Tsarist regime went completely nuts about any sorts of opposition. And they also became extremely suspicious of their own people, firmly believing that Russians were easily susceptible to foreign hostile influence. That is, by the way, the main explanation for the mass repressions in the country. But it has also affected Russian foreign policy. Even when Soviet governments supported popular or independence movements and leaders in other countries, they became suspicious of those leaders and tried to subdue them. If that failed, they would kill them. The biggest Soviet contribution to the Spanish Civil War, very accurately described by George Orwell in his Homage to Catalonia, was the repressions conducted by the Chekists sent by Stalin. The meticulous and systematic murder of anarchists and anyone suspected of sympathizing with Trotsky, including Andrei Nin, the leader of the Communist Party affiliated with Trotsky. There was a short period of time when the Soviet Union at least appeared to support popular and independence movements around the world out of ideological commitment in some sense of the future. It was under Nikita Khrushchev, Nina Khrushchev's great-grandfather, and I'm really sorry that she couldn't be here today. But Khrushchev's ousting shows to me that it was a deviation of the Soviet politics. When those activists and leaders of all revolutionary and popular movements found refuge in Moscow, which also happened, it destroyed their lives, because they were given not a safe haven, but a cage, a carefully controlled environment. Vladimir Pozner, present here today, could attest to this. When he was brought to Moscow from the United States, because his father was a Soviet agent, Stalin was still alive. And I would recommend you rewatching the excellent movie, The Death of Stalin, to grasp the atmosphere of his last months under Stalin. It was completely terrifying. And it is very likely, because of this traumatic experience, I suspect, that Vladimir Pozner agreed to become the chief Kremlin propagandist for Radio Moscow's English service and has spent decades while arguing Moscow's point of view since the Cold War, that including justifying crimes. For instance, Vladimir Pozner argued that the Korean Airlines Boeing, shot down by a Soviet fighter jet in 1983, 269 people were killed, was a spy plane. That continued under Putin. When asked about MH17 Boeing, which had been downed in 2014 by Russian-backed forces over Ukraine, he dismissed the idea that Russia should take responsibility, calling it a speculation. There is a continuity of the treatment of political exiles in today's Russia. Take Edward Snowden, a whistleblower who had bravely exposed US mass surveillance programs. Once he found himself in Moscow, he was given a Russian handler, a lawyer closely connected to the Russian security service FSB, and his contacts with journalists were put under strict control. I know that because I've been trying for years to interview Snowden, as many of my Russian colleagues. We ended up exchanging public comments via Guardian, but he never ever spoke to Russian journalists because the Kremlin wanted to keep him on a short leash. And today, Snowden still has access to his social media accounts and he speaks via Zoom to Western universities, but he remains remarkably silent about the Russian war in Ukraine. He said he didn't talk about the Ukrainian crisis in depth because he knew that his comments were, I quote, not going to be covered in context. But we, Russians, all know the real reason. It's fear. It is very scary to say something about such a sensitive topic when you are in Russia. Look at how many people ended up in jail for speaking out against the war. And everyone who is in Russia or have relatives in Russia always think about it. I think about it every time when I speak in public, because my father, a Russian internet pioneer, has been in jail since last July. The Kremlin doesn't love internet pioneers these days. Fear is the main factor which determines what people say and what sometimes they think in Russia. That is not what we see in the United States. A famous Soviet dissident, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, when he was expelled from the Soviet Union, found refuge in the United States. That didn't prevent him from delivering a rather damning speech at Harvard in 1974, attacking the US and the West for their spiritual crisis, lack of civil courage, and materialism. Needless to say, he was never arrested or prosecuted for expressing his views in the US. Fear is a driving force behind Russian foreign policy. There is, of course, also imperialism and the desire for respect and recognition from the United States, but nothing surpasses fear. After all, Putin himself claims that the threat of NATO expansion triggered Russia's invasion of Ukraine, essentially a fear of losing the Russian sphere of influence. And it is also fear of regime change that determines the Kremlin's choice of allies, like Lukashenko or Assad. It is a very dark vision of the world that completely rules out any change in society because the Kremlin views the world solely in terms of threats. In conclusion, While the US and Russia may sometimes take similar, morally questionable and deplorable actions, their foreign policies are driven by fundamentally different motivations. US foreign policy, though often controversial, is driven by ambition, the desire to shape the global order. Russian foreign policy is driven by fear, fear of internal unrest, fear of foreign interference in its affairs, and fear of the future. It remains essentially a defensive posture, rooted in historical insecurities and deep-seated fear of regime change. Therefore, there is indeed a profound moral difference between the two. Thank you.
The Russian and American foreign policies are by definition not contingent on morality. The ultimate and only goal of the foreign policy of both countries is to protect their own interests.
To close the case for side proposition, I look to the operation officers from Christchurch, Lisa Burkova.
Dear members, at this point you have heard quite literally from almost everybody in this debate. And because of that, you will know that this is not about defending either Russia or the US. It is also not about comparing its leaders. As you have heard today, both countries have done indefensible things, and all leaders have proved to act in psychopathic ways. It is tempting to draw comparisons between the two people currently in power of both countries. Both Putin and Trump have become trademarks or symbols of the countries that they govern. But any comparison between the two individuals from a moral perspective is ultimately fallacious. A few weeks ago, Trump has stepped into office for the second time to kick off his 5th year. Putin is currently serving his 21st year as president. Even the timescales themselves show that there is little point in hyper-focusing on individual actions of individual leaders and trying to tally up how much damage each one has done to be able to understand which one is morally superior. At the same time, there is no way how we can entirely separate the foreign policies from the people who run those countries. And that is not what I'm asking you to do today. Instead, it is imperative that we take a look at the biggest scale of both countries and the moral baggage of their actions on an international level. I will try to set aside any detailed focus on individual cases which can be discussed under the context of the US and Russian foreign policies. We all know very well that things are not black and white in politics. There is a billion ways how one could defend Putin's war in Ukraine, and just as many reasons to justify the American invasion of Iraq. Hence, any level of granularity will only impede from making an objective judgment. Ultimately, I will try to prove two things to you. Firstly, that the US and Russia have equally amoral foreign policies. Secondly, as a result of this, it also means that they are morally identical, even if both can try to claim the moral high ground. Firstly, however, I would like to extend my gratitude to the President and to the rest of the committee. I was made aware today, under somewhat unusual circumstances, that I would be speaking here now. This debate means a lot to me, both because I have a close personal connection to the motion which is being discussed today, but also because I have had the pleasure of organizing this particular debate from the very start. This is my first year at this university, and I have not been part of the committee for a very long time. It is therefore an honor for me to be able to have this opportunity tonight, and it is not something that I take lightly. Mr. President, thank you. Firstly, let me assure you, ladies and gentlemen, while I am a Russian citizen, born and raised in Moscow, by parents who do not speak very much English, and an alleged oligarch for a father, I promise that I am not in the business of glorifying war, death, and suffering. Not many people in this room are more closely affected by the war in Ukraine than I am. Setting aside the rationalized practicalities of it, I, like most Russians, am fully aware of the morality of what it entails. Ladies and gentlemen, among others, it is young men, boys aged the same as me, 18-year-olds, who are being sent to do the dirty work on both sides. Boys my age who are dying. Some people I could have known. I was in the UK when the news of the start of the war have broken the early morning silence. My best friend, a Russian citizen, was at the time in Kiev at a family celebration. This was the day when she was supposed to fly back to me, when the airspace has closed above Ukraine only a few hours before. The next 2 weeks we have spent on the phone while she was hiding in a parking lot under her house, which was transformed into a bunker, when she would tell me the sounds of explosions that she heard that day. She was able to escape the borders on a bus of a religious group. Not everyone is lucky enough to escape, and I'm particularly painfully aware of that, just as I am aware of the immorality of these specific circumstances. I'm also not partial towards the American claims of defending democracy and human rights, since every one of such claims is buried by a veil of generational hypocrisy, as I will go on to discuss. The president speaking before me was generous when he said that Americans are not acting in self-interest, hypocrisy being only a step or several steps beyond the immorality of blatant lies and manipulation used specifically for self-interest. I therefore do not think that the US has any foundation to claim the moral high ground. Just like Russians have been affected by the horrors of military acts in Ukraine, many Americans have been equally as affected by the results of military actions and interventions of the US. Invasion of Grenada in 1983, invasion of Panama in 1989, Iraq War, invasion of Afghanistan, Libyan intervention in the Syrian civil war. You have heard the president's speech before me. You know that the list goes on. You have also heard the treasurer on the opposition, who started with her own personal experience of it. However, the Russian and American foreign policies are by definition not contingent on morality. The ultimate and only goal of the foreign policy of both countries is to protect their own interests. Whether this is seen as selfish or virtuous by you makes little difference, because the concept in itself is an amoral one. Let me be clear, by amoral I do not mean immoral, which suggests that it is violating moral principles or is deliberately wrong or evil. No, amoral means lacking a sense of morality, or being neutral or indifferent to moral considerations. It describes actions or systems that operate outside of the framework of right and wrong. Both countries heavily rely on power to achieve their aims. Yes, when possible, they try to do so with the approval of international institutions, but the lack of support from such institutions has not and will not ever stop either of these countries from pursuing whatever their goals are. The international cause have not prevented the US from commencing drone attacks in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, which led to extrajudicial killings. Later in time, they simply threatened to sanction the ICJ and the ICC against any moralist argument, suggesting that the international cause threaten US sovereignty. They themselves deny the validity of moralist arguments. Ladies and gentlemen, shouldn't we be thinking of this? This is saying something to us. Similarly, Russia accepts the rulings of International Court of Justice only on a case-to-case basis. It is not a member of the International Criminal Court and was expelled from the European Court of Human Rights. The only underlying motivation for these countries is and will always be power. Power as a way to ensure that these countries do everything in their own interest, and hence power as an end in itself. But power itself is a concept without morality. Asking whether this power is moral or immoral is like asking what color sound is, or what does sleep taste like. It is not a question that has an answer to it. This is not to say that both countries do not employ the rhetoric of morality and ethics in their positions. However, all of this is only a manifestation of pragmatism, which is easily digested by the general masses. The sole existence of Guantanamo Bay is the pinnacle of American pragmatism. Human rights and values are only of any interest until they are interrogating the alleged members of Al-Qaeda and Taliban. The US government argued that Guantanamo was chosen because it was outside the US legal jurisdiction, allowing the detention of prisoners without granting them the constitutional rights they would have on US soil. They are not denying anything. Yet again, my goal is not to defend these organizations, but it's almost amusing to see how any mention of rights dissolves the moment that it is no longer in the interest of the American image. In the same way, claiming that Russia logically picks out the steps to maximize human suffering or any other sort of immoral acts is equally as irrational. Throughout the last couple of years, Russia has been blatantly clear about exactly what its aims are, and it would be ignorant to claim that pragmatism has not been the only sentiment that it has expressed. It would perhaps be an important argument if it were true that the actions of America have resulted in a positive outcome around the world, while the Russian ones have not. I can promise you now that this is not what the Russian media is saying. They're saying the exact opposite, that the Russians are the ones saving the world, whilst the Americans are the ones harming it. However, it is worth nothing trying to argue whose propaganda should be trusted, since the positive outcome is, at the end of the day, not the goal either. The positive outcome is a mere side effect which can be effectively weaponized against any opposition. Any positive outcome is quickly snatched up and used and abused. The goal in itself is power, and power is pragmatic, and pragmatism is amoral. The last speaker on the opposition has mentioned fear and ambition. But why do we think that either fear or ambition in themselves are moral either? Power, fear, ambition, none of these claims have any moral value to them. So if that is the case, then how can we say that one is any different than the other? How is amoral any different from amoral? It is all good and well to pick out what the consequences of certain political actions are, but the moral value of these actions is post facto assigned to them by us. Ladies and gentlemen, we assign things value which was never there in the first place. Ladies and gentlemen, do not let us be hypocrites ourselves. Let us not judge policies based on values that we have assigned to them ourselves. Let us recognize that at their heart, neither country gives a damn about what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong. There is no moral difference because there is no morality in it. Therefore, I urge you to vote for proposition. Thank you.
They both pursue what is best to maintain their regional hegemony and power, not to adhere to any moral standard. Realpolitik is the command of the day, not morality.
Though the US has committed probably on impact the same amount of catastrophes, war crimes, the way that they operate is different from Russia in terms of how they practice their foreign policy and to the justifications used, which is often under capitalist and neoliberal frameworks.
Between 2018 to 2025 alone, American government undertook, under the guise of counterterrorism operations, in more than 70 countries. By contrast, Russia, 25 military interventions since 1991, yet Russia is aggressive.
American democracy may be challenged, but our Constitution, our system of government, ain't broken.
The Russian and American foreign policies are by definition not contingent on morality. The ultimate and only goal of the foreign policy of both countries is to protect their own interests.
After all, Putin himself claims that the threat of NATO expansion triggered Russia's invasion of Ukraine, essentially a fear of losing the Russian sphere of influence.
Good afternoon, members. Today we're being joined by Professor Kathleen Stock, a former philosophy professor before she resigned at the University of Sussex, citing the attacks she received by her colleagues and students due to her views. Her book, Material Girls, has received wide notoriety for these views and her opposition to proposed changes to the Gender Recognition Act. A quick word from me about the format tonight. We'll be doing the Q&A from the dispatch boxes. If you'd prefer to ask your question from your seat, that is absolutely fine. And if you just, after you put your hand up, if you stay stood where you are, someone will come over with a microphone. We've chosen to do this format in order to allow all our members to engage with and challenge with Professor Stock's views on what we believe is an incredibly important conversation and debate on this issue. So thank you to Professor Stock for agreeing to take part in this discussion, and welcome to the Oxford Union. So, Professor Stock, I thought we'd start just by sort of setting the intellectual parameters of this discussion. And so you've said in your book that one thing that you don't care about is sort of people having their own inner gender identities, but it's when these private beliefs become reified into law that you have a problem. I was wondering if you could just sort of clarify exactly what your problem is by what you see as a reification of a fiction.
Oh, well, I don't think gender identity is a fiction, actually. So, and when you say I don't care about it, actually, I think gender identity, unlike some of my fellow feminists, I actually think people can have gender identities. I just certainly don't think everyone does, but I think some people feel some kind of way about their sex bodies that leads them to feel that they're more masculine than their female body, or they're more feminine than their male body. But what I think is crazy is to try and have laws and policies based on what is essentially something totally internal that no one else can see. And trans activism tells us all the time that no one can tell you what your gender identity is, only you can know. And we're supposed to accept what someone says about their gender identity as soon as they say it. And if that is the basis on which people are getting access to certain spaces where women are vulnerable, or sports teams, or shortlists, or whatever it is, it's just way too open to malfeasance.
And on that sort of question of the morality of trans women's access to those spaces, in your book, you set this out in fairly utilitarian terms. And you say, and I quote, that the harms to trans people, quote, need to be considered alongside the potential costs of effectively allowing any male at all into places where females are unusually vulnerable to sexual assault. On balance, I don't think the former harm outweighs the latter. And I think that most people would perhaps agree with you if the evidence suggested that allowing trans women, or perhaps their male impersonators, into female-only spaces would result in a marked rise in sexual violence against women. My question to you is, if the evidence actually showed the contrary, that there was no increase in the violence committed to cis women, and that, on the contrary, by not doing the proposed changes, trans women experience greater harm themselves, would you change your view on their inclusion to these spaces?
So no evidence of an increase in violence against women compared to what?
So compared to the status quo, i.e., as in if we now say that people can self-identify and go into a bathroom,
yeah.
and as a result of that, we do not see there is no greater rise
yeah.
in, just hypothetically, in an
So if by some amazing turn of events, a male-bodied person saying, I am a woman, somehow automatically took them out of the patterns of male violence for their sex, and meant that from then on they were just, I imagine in this thought experiment, we're reducing them to the patterns of violence, sexual violence of women, for instance, and women are already in changing rooms, so if that's the thought experiment. And if we could establish this, I think we're talking about quite a far away possible world myself, but if we could establish this, then yes, I'm not a fanatic.
Sure.
So yes, if we could establish that. Of course, I don't think we can establish that, because I think we live in this world where males show the patterns of violence that they do.
Yeah, but the reason you come to that conclusion is on a sort of utilitarian calculus.
It's funny to hear you say that I'm utilitarian because I would normally not think of myself that way, but I do think when it comes to policies and you're balancing interests, you have to take, especially when it comes to safeguarding, because safeguarding is an area where you're supposed to be quite paranoid. You know, you're supposed to have extra safeguarding in, even though not every male predates, but you still say in the safeguarding of children, you do a lot of things to stop that paedophile from becoming the nursery teacher or whatever, extra things like, and that's not to say that every nursery teacher is a paedophile, ridiculous. So in the area of changing rooms or prisons or whatever it is where women are getting undressed, you're supposed to do extra stuff. And when we took all the males out before, as it were, as far as we could, it wasn't on the assumption that all males were predators. Far from it. It was on the assumption that some are, a few are, but that they are determined and that this will increase their opportunity. So we want to, like, rationally take into account the interests of women who are in those spaces. And up until now, up until recently, we have not been doing that as a society. The way this discourse goes, nobody seems to care about the women. And that's what I care about.
So let's break down the risks as you see it. So one risk is of male impersonators. Is that a fair characterization?
It's a risk of a man saying he's a woman and going into space and taking advantage of that. Now, there's an extra discussion about whether that person is genuinely trans or not, because transactivism has cast the net of trans women so wide that you'd be very hard-pressed to have a definition which said they weren't. But if you want to have that sort of no true trans woman sort of thing, no one that ever committed sexual violence against women could possibly be a real trans woman, you could do that. I'm not sure how it would work.
I think there's surely a distinction between a trans woman who commits sexual violence against women and someone who, in every other aspect of their life, identifies as a cis man and then says, I'm a trans woman, only to go into a space.
There is, but there's also a massive penumbra of different circumstances between those two, like partly cross-dressing, someone who's enjoying being able to go into changing rooms on a regular basis. And those people, I mean, I'm not naive about male sexuality. I'm afraid those people do exist.
But for the type who are not bona fide, genuine trans women, you know, if they go into these spaces and commit sexual violence, is the issue here not one of identification and access, but one of, you know, the legislation to police and enforce against sexual violence? As in, these spaces are not that typically policed. So currently there are not that many things, even without any inclusive legislation, that would stop just a cis man from walking in without even having to say that they're a trans woman. So I think my question is, when we look at that harm, how much of it is derivative of this potential change and how much just exists within the status quo?
Well, the thing about that status quo argument, which comes up a lot, which is basically, although you didn't put it this crudely, look, women are already going to get raped, so what does it matter? I mean, you didn't put it like that, but okay, status quo, yes, those spaces are not policed. There's no security guard on the door, thank God, because we haven't got the resources and it would be kind of weird. So most changing rooms, for instance, operate on a shared understanding of social norm. And that's all we have, is the shared understanding of the social norm that up until, 20 years ago, with some exceptions, but females would go in this space and males would go in that space. And when you've got the well-understood social norm, you can afford to be relaxed about the edge cases.
I think one of the sort of criticisms you've probably heard a lot is that your argument places too much emphasis on biological factors when it comes to the potential harms that might arise from allowing those who are nasal males but trans women access into these spaces. Obviously, it's an evidenced fact that nasal men have far higher likelihood to commit sexual violence against women, but does that derive purely from biological factors, or are there societal factors as well? And if there are societal factors, do some of those not change when a nasal man transitions to a trans woman?
Okay, so yes, it's a combination of biology and social factors. I don't think men are born to sexually assault women, although I do think that testosterone has, I mean, basically everything about human behavior is a combination of genetic background, biology, and social organization. And obviously there are some societies that have massive violence against women, and there are some societies that don't, but the biology is shared. But that's not to say the biology is irrelevant either. It's complicated, as most things about the interaction between the human and the social world are. However, to concede that, which is not really a concession, I absolutely would be happy to admit that, the bit that I never did understand about current transactivism is that it seems to think that you could just leap to the end. So say that we admit, okay, you can socialize men out of sexual violence. Well, surely we should have a game plan, you know, like maybe we should say, right, at the very end of this process, we will have self-ID, but we're not going to start with self-ID as the means by which we change the social order. Self-ID is the thing that you do at the very end, if we're right, when you've tamed everybody or whatever you're supposed to have done socially. But so, no, I don't think that, and remember that the context in which I came into this debate was not when the Gender Recognition Act came in, it was when self-ID was on the table as a policy that every single party was signed up to. So it wasn't about surgically transitioned, hormonally altered people. It was about anybody, basically anybody, saying, I am now a female and I can come into this space. So do I think that changes their social relationship to females? Absolutely, I do not.
But surely, though, if you are a trans woman and you're in one of the most marginalized groups that is the recipient of a huge amount of violence, would you not concede that you are then less likely to commit violence against cis women than a cis man would be? Or do you not think...
No, that's just not how human psychology works, I'm afraid. I mean, there's a number of assumptions there I would want to unpick, and one of them which we hear all the time, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to say the heretical thing, is that Britain is quite a liberal society, and we have far more racist violence than we have transphobic violence in this country. So that is a message that's come through transactivism and has been repeated uncritically by many a media outlet, and is backed up by Stonewall surveys where they ask people, have you ever felt aggressed? You know, so a lot of those surveys are based on people's reported feelings, and that's not the way you would normally look at levels of violence. It's complicated because obviously convictions are not going to absolutely represent crime, but certainly you shouldn't just go around to a bunch of people and say, do you feel like you've been a victim of a hate crime lately? And particularly not when you're telling them that a hate crime is to misgender them. So, in other words, I would push back a bit on that first assumption, but let's say that I grant you that assumption. I'm afraid it doesn't follow that people that are subject to violence are not violent. I think you need to talk to some criminologists.
Okay, but I think just to push back against that, I think that presumably, as in even if in that case that the reason I've given you don't think is likely, I find it hard to believe that what we take to be true of the natal subset of men, i.e. that as a group is likely to commit sexual violence as women, must necessarily hold true for the natal subset of men that want to transition to be a woman. Because surely those are two very different groups.
Why?
And I think, why
are they different groups?
Because one thinks that they are a man, feels comfortable in their body, and one wants to reject everything about being a natal man. And so I think so I think, you know, the subtitle to your book, Why Reality Matters, I think that throughout a lot of your arguments, what some critics of you might say is that you cherry pick what reality means. Because as well as being a biological reality, surely there is a reality to those who say, I am not a man. And whether you agree with that or not, I think it's a huge assumption for you to then say, nothing about that reality, even if we say it's just their reality, will have an impact on the likelihood they are to commit sexual violence or anything else.
Well,
and unless there's some evidence to back up your claim.
Can I point you to some statistics? And I mean, these statistics are uncomfortable to say, and it's why very often they don't get mentioned, because my detractors automatically think I'm talking about all trans women when I raise them. And so I just want to preface this by saying that I absolutely am not saying that all trans women are violent. I have never said that. I say that opposite in the book. I just need to make that absolutely clear before I go into the statistics. In the same way, if I was about to mention male pattern violence statistics, I would not be saying that every man in this chamber is likely to assault somebody. I don't think you are. I have 2 sons. I have happy relationships with men. it's not, I'm not, you know, I just have to stress this. However, Ministry of Justice statistics on the number, so if you take the number of trans women in prison in Britain, and you get the same stat in the US statistics, at least 50% are in there for sexual assault, okay? So, and then that's a higher rate than the average male. Now, that is not to say that I am saying that there's something about being a trans woman that makes you violent. I am saying that we need to look at those. You asked me to provide some evidence. I provided you some evidence. I hate to be the one that keeps having to tell people this sort of thing, because it absolutely, you know, is the sort of thing that these people outside totally misunderstand about what I'm saying. But somebody has to say it. You can go and look at the stats yourself.
Well, so let's have a reasoned debate about the stats, because so the first point, as you said, it's not about being all trans. Sorry if I misrepresented my question, but I don't think that, as in, of course, that's not what I was trying to construe. The question is whether it is a statistically significant number as to cause a greater harm that we need to weigh.
Well, I thought you were looking for some evidence that there was that something, you know, you're suggesting that somehow, it seems to me that you're suggesting that a male-bodied person who says, I'm a woman, because they really feel like a woman, want to reject everything about being, stereotypically about being a male, including sexual assault, if that's a stereotype at all about males, which I don't know. And I'm saying, well, look, there are actually quite a high number, relatively speaking, of trans women in prison who have, even though they say they're female, committed sexual assault. So that seems to suggest that there is not this amazing
well,
transformation.
Absolutely. Well, just to quickly clarify, my point wasn't that trans women want to reject the stereotype that men are violent, but rather there are clearly different societal experiences of trans women and men, and one of the results of that might be a decrease in violence. And you know, so when we're talking about evidence, what would you say about Hashenbusch's paper on non-discrimination laws in Massachusetts, where you know, the researchers compared localities that had passed self-ID and those that hadn't, and the resounding outcome was that in both compared to before and after the passage of those bills, there was no statistical increase in violence or privacy-related crimes in women's-only spaces.
When was this paper?
2019.
Okay.
And I agree with you to say that the evidence isn't conclusive at the moment.
Well, what I say in the book is that we need to go and look, and that is certainly a piece of evidence I would want to look at. In my experience, when I've Googled, for instance, when I was writing the book, and especially America, where I really think that this issue is much more talked about here than it is even in America, I would find a strange phenomenon where you couldn't find, you know, trans women in changing rooms assault so-and-so, but you could find cross-dressing man, right? So there would be this distinction made. As soon as a man cross-dressing was found in a changing room or wherever, you know, where he shouldn't have been, he was automatically assumed to be a malfeasant, well, obviously he was, but also a cross-dresser as opposed to a real trans woman. And so that, if that's the distinction that's being made, it's going to affect the stats, because you're going to find that anyone you find there is going to turn out to be in the wrong category. So I would want to look at their categories. I would also just want to look how hard they're looking. And I also want to talk to the women who are using these facilities.
As in, I can't answer any of those questions. But so moving away from the question of, moving away from looking at the side of the scale that affects cis women using these spaces already.
It affects all women using these spaces. I mean, I don't use cis.
Well,
anyway.
I will, but you know, do you accept that there'll be harm caused to trans women by not letting them enter these spaces? Because presumably, if we think that, you know, if there's a reason for there to be sex-segregated bathrooms because men are likely to, or more likely, or there's a high chance of men committing sexual violence, the way I see it is if a trans woman then has to go into a male bathroom, they will be perhaps visibly identifiable. Everyone in there is a man. Surely they are at immense risk of those exact same things. And so why then does that not seem to be a relevant moral factor?
Well, you haven't read the final chapter of my book. Because I have. Because I agree with you. I agree with you. And I'm not saying that all trans women, no matter what they look like, no matter what surgical intervention they've had, should be in the males. I'm saying that if we have enough resources to throw millions at Stonewall, for instance, we can use some of that into lobbying for a range of spaces that protects everybody.
Well, I think that just on the sort of, you know, there's on the sort of on the third alternative of creating a third space, I think that most trans people would have two responses to that. First is that, one, it is currently impractical given the numbers and the thing that there are public bathrooms nearly everywhere throughout the country, so the infrastructure investment would be impossible.
Yeah, it'd be difficult.
And even if it wasn't, that it is somewhat subordinating. I have read the final chapter of your book. But talking on your book, my question then to you is, why then in your chapter, Why Sex Matters, when you say we should also consider the harms to trans